Welcome to the Nantucket Gam, a podcast by the Nantucket Historical Association. I'm Annalie Gilbert-Keith.
I'm Thomas Parrish.
And I'm Adam Zalog.
This month, we're talking about the oldest house. So, which house on Nantucket is the oldest, Thomas?
I mean, it's actually a really interesting question. We are going to be talking about the oldest house on its original foundation, which we call the oldest house up on Sunset Hill. It's an NHA property. You can go visit in the summer. But to be frank, there are a couple of structures that might be older, but they've been moved around or rebuilt in a way that they're not on the original foundation.
Classic Nantucket.
Yep.
For some of our visitors who maybe haven't visited in this summer, the oldest house is a pretty interesting historic building. It sits atop a hill on the northwest side of the historic downtown with a big open front lawn that slopes down to Coffin Park. The house is a sturdy, shingled building with small glass windows that has a large brick chimney rising up in the center of the structure. On the chimney, there's an upside-down U shape, or a horseshoe, of unknown origin, and on the back side of the chimney, it leads to a long, sloping roof that overlooks the kitchen garden. It certainly is a unique sight.
When was the oldest house, the NHA property, built?
So it's said to be built in 1686. So just for context, this is 90 years before the U.S. even exists. So it's very much an English construction.
When you get into, said to be built, for a lot of these houses that are that old, I would imagine that it's a little bit like he said, she said, when it comes to the actual age of the property, right?
Yeah, so again, this is way before the U.S. existed, and the paperwork no longer exists. So it's been reported to be built in 1686 for over a century now. But we don't have the hard paperwork that says, today I built the oldest house in 1686.
It'd be pretty cool if we had a piece of paper that named it the oldest house in 1686.
Yeah, today I built the newest house in 1686.
And it was built as a gift, correct?
It was. It was built for the young couple, Jethro Coffin and Mary Gardner. And the marriage was actually pretty significant because Jethro's grandfather, Tristram Coffin, and Mary's father, John Gardner, they really did not see eye to eye on almost anything. They had very different political views of where power should lie in the new English settlement. Tristram Coffin really advocated for the rights and privileges of the first wave of English settlers. John Gardner thought that the second wave of English arrivals should have comparable status in the English community. And Coffin and Gardner would butt heads on everything. But Tristram Coffin's grandson, Jethro, and John Gardner's daughter, Mary Gardner, fell in love, and they eventually got married. And so this conflict between the two, Tristram Coffin and John Gardner, is seen as coming to a symbolic end with the construction of this house and the unification of the two families.
And it's sort of a classic English story of class warfare, right? Because I seem to remember the first group of arrivals were more aristocratic, and the second group were craftsmen.
In a way, yeah. But there was a relative equality on the island. You had to do the work, and everyone would do the work. And the first arrivals all got equal-sized plots of land. So even though there was this more aristocratic, we are the first ones here, we should have more political power that Tristram Coffin advocated for. There was sort of that class division where the second wave of people came to work, right? They needed to supplement the labor, like fishing and farming and translating. That's what John Gardner's generation of settlers did. And so with the construction of this house, it was built with Coffin lumber on Gardner land, and Jethro and Mary would live there for the next 30 years.
I guess that's why in some NHA publications of years gone by, you will see the oldest house often referred to as the Jethro Coffin house.
It is, yes. There's a couple names for it. The oldest house, the Jethro Coffin house, the horseshoe house, because on the chimney is an upside-down horseshoe-looking shape. You don't actually know what that is for. Some people say it's to pour luck on the house. Some people say it's to keep witches away.
It's very fancy for 1686 to have a decorative chimney.
This house was pretty fancy for its day. That large brick chimney in the center of the structure would have been pretty expensive. You had to import a lot of the bricks to the island, and that's a lot of brick to put in a house. But there's also other features, right? They had windows. All glass at this point was being imported from England, so it's by no means cheap. And it's located up on Sunset Hill with a nice view.
It's an early colonial mansion, sort of, is what you're saying.
And that upside-down horseshoe, in my opinion, was just decoration. And decoration is a luxury in of itself. And the first English settlement was established 1659, so we're only, about 30 years after the first English people arrived on this island.
Did the house more or less look the way that it does now when it was built?
That's a really interesting question, and the short answer is no. When it was first built, it would have looked a lot more rectangular than it is today. The long sloping roof didn't exist yet, nor did the summer kitchen in the rear. So when it was constructed in what's called a hall and parlor style, which means that you have two main spaces. You have, can you take a guess? The hall and a
foyer.
and a parlor. That were your two real spaces that you use. It's a story and a half, so there is some upstairs space, but this isn't a bedroom per se. It's probably more just for storage. And the hall and parlor are more to use spaces. The hall is much more informal. You would use it for cooking, your dining room, your workroom, possibly your bedroom as well. It's really a flex space. It's the center of family life. And the parlor, that's your fancy room. It's where you would invite guests. If there was a guest who was spending the night, that's probably where they would stay. It's where you have your best furniture. That's it. It was essentially just those two rooms with some storage above. The structure that we know today, with the long sloping roof and the extra kitchen in the rear, that really came to be under the home's second owners, the Paddock family.
So you mentioned that Jethro and Mary lived there for 30 years?
They did, yeah. So they moved in, supposedly, in 1686, and then they would sell it in the first decade of the 1700s.
So even though it was known for a while as the Jethro Coffin House, he didn't really live there very long.
Well, it still is known as the Jethro Coffin House because he was the first male figure who lived there. Mary Gardner kind of gets pushed under the rug there. But they would eventually sell it to the Paddocks, Nathaniel Paddock, who was a weaver on the island. In my opinion, it could be easily called the Paddock House as well, because the Paddock family would live there for nearly 120 years.
Wow.
But a paddock is a different type of structure.
We have one for the goats.
Does the Paddock House an oxymoron then? But this is really interesting change when the Paddocks take over the house. It's around this time, I think probably just after the Paddocks take it, that they add this long lean-to on the back. This is what creates the salt box style house with the asymmetry of the front and back, where the front is more upright and the back has this long sloping roof. And they add what became known as the summer kitchen, what we call the summer kitchen today, where you can cook and there's more windows and it opens up the space. But in doing so, they also change the roof line. They actually bring the roof from the front of the chimney to the back of the chimney. And what's really interesting is that there's some evidence to suggest that the house that's very simplistic looking on the front now actually had two pretty large dormers, which are protrusions of windows, which would have made the facade look much more imposing, much more impressive. And it's believed that if those existed, they were taken off at the same time that we added the cat slide roof to make that salt box style house in the back.
I guess we could say that long roof kind of faces north and opens up onto a kitchen garden.
Yeah, facing something natural.
Yeah, exactly. And that the way up to the house from the street,
From Sunset,
you actually don't really see the majority of the house. You just see the facade. You just see what's left once those dormers were gone.
Exactly. Yeah, where you have that first floor that's vertical, that 90-degree angle to the ground, and then just a sloping roof that goes up to the chimney. If you walk around, that then converts into this very long roof that almost reaches to the ground.
And it's on a very large property as well. I mean, for modern Nantucket, it's on a very large property.
Well, that used to be two properties, in fact. In 1726, the Paddocks actually built a second home, which became known as the Paddock House, on that property as well. So there used to be two houses there.
And what were they using that for?
Well, he built it for his two sons. Some of the family would live in what's now the oldest house. Some of them would live at the Paddock House.
Where did that house go? Where is it?
It does not exist anymore. It was built in 1726. It would last 200 years, but eventually it was torn down in 1926. The owner of that house wanted to tear it down to use the materials and build a new property, a more modern property. The NHA and many other people really wanted him to keep it. It was a great example and comparison between the oldest house just next door and the Paddock House of this early generation of Nantucket architecture. Ultimately, the owner decided he was just going to tear it down regardless.
Seems like such a bummer to tear down a historic home.
I mean, ultimately, that demolition would provide a really quite interesting opportunity because it happened at the time when Nantucket really started to care about the oldest house, about the Jethro Coffin House. And people were already visiting it as a tourist attraction. So when the Paddock House was torn down, historic lumber from that house was reused and incorporated pretty heavily into a 1920s restoration of the oldest house.
Wait, at what point did the house go from being lived in to becoming a tourist attraction?
You're right. We did jump ahead a little bit there. To back up, the Paddocks lived there for about 132 years, and eventually they sell it to George and Mary Turner. By this point, the building's already almost 200 years old. And so in 1870, the Turners move out because it's not really livable anymore. But the first tangible moment that really cements the oldest house as a place in Nantucket history is in 1881, where the Coffin family, who we've talked about previously on this episode, have a family reunion. Well, they decide to really center it at the place that most directly connects them back to their shared ancestor, Tristram Coffin. And that's the Jethro Coffin House, the grandson of Tristram Coffin.
That's sort of when the house becomes famous?
Yeah, it really gets grounded in this Coffin family heritage. And then immediately after, another Tristram Coffin, this is actually a lawyer in Poughkeepsie, so different Tristram than the one that was here in 1659.
There are many Tristram Coffins.
The Tristram Coffin purchased the oldest house and eventually opens it as a sort of museum. It had custodians who would show people and just basic maintenance to keep it standing.
Was this the person that was doing the restoration that you mentioned before?
No, he was not really interested in doing major restoration. He just wanted to keep it from falling down. And when the Turners left, they were basically just using it as a barn because this old structure wasn't really usable. And so Tristram Coffin took it over, maintained it, but eventually as he got older, he wanted to pass it along, and eventually the NHA acquired it in the 1920s.
And when the NHA was founded, and still to this day, our goal is really preserving Nantucket history. So is the NHA then the party that's doing the work on the oldest house?
They would initiate the restoration. Tristram Coffin wanted to keep it a little bit derelict, but the NHA really wanted to make sure it lasted. So they decided to do a pretty major restoration. Another Coffin would step in, a man named Winthrop Coffin, and he decided to underwrite the entire restoration if the NHA agrees to work with William Sumner Appleton and the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, or SPNIA for short.
Why was he so hooked on the NHA working with Appleton?
Well, Appleton's actually a really foundational figure in restoration, who founded SPNIA, which is now called Historic New England. He was a real advocate for a very dogmatic, real scientific approach to restoration. He was really passionate about preservation, especially in New England, and passionate about preserving the oldest house. I think one of the best stories to describe Appleton is that he would just go in with Tristram Coffin's permission and take measurements of things like sills and send that to him and say, hey, Tristram, here's the measurement of your sill. Not requested, not needed, just...
We have a couple of people who are still a little bit like that around the island today, I would say.
When it comes to this urge of preserving in a very scientific way. And now we have those measurements, right? Now we know what it actually was. But when the oldest house comes into the possession of the NHA, Tristram Coffin writes to William Sumner Appleton saying, quote, my aim throughout the 42 years I have owned the oldest house property at Nantucket is to preserve the precious relic from destruction and damage by the elements, and to leave it outside and inside as near as the same condition as it was when I bought it. The same as it was when it ceased to be occupied as a residence, and I hope that the Historical Association will not lessen the interest that attaches to it by improvement, but will leave the interior in the half-ruinous condition it has been in ever since.
I can't imagine selling a house and instructing people to, keep it a little dilapidated for the people.
Keep it ruinous, yeah. But people, especially in the early 1900s, people love a dilapidated building. They loved a derelict building. Like, it is part of the aesthetic. Like, even when we acquired the mill, the NHA acquired the mill, there was debate about whether to fix it or not because it looked old. It looked falling down, and falling down looks older. Mm. And people liked that as part of the draw. I think this is actually the most photographed period, besides the modern era with cell phones, the most photographed era of the oldest house is when it looked its worst. And that desire to keep it looking old would be a motivating factor moving forward.
Interesting. So that sort of gets us into a territory of thinking about the mythos of the oldest house and what people are going to the oldest house to see versus the history that we have in the records.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. By the 1920s, the oldest house is already a well-known symbol of Nantucket history. People were going to see it with a very specific lens in mind, especially with the connection to Nantucket's early years. It has come to represent more than just a coffin family relic, but this real testament to an early era of Nantucket history. But there's a very clear example of the contrast between what people want to see and what the record shows. Appleton and the lead architect, Alfred Shirks, really felt that the first version of the oldest house, when it was built for Jethro and Mary, probably had these pretty large dormers, these big protrusions on the front that create a very imposing facade. But this style of more complicated architecture is often seen as being more modern. And think about other pre-evolutionary homes on Nantucket. They tend to be simpler, more of this plain Quaker style. On the other hand, Winthrop Coffin, the underwriter, and William Macy, the president of the NHA, felt that these dormers don't fit. Macy has a quote in a letter to Winthrop Coffin, which he writes, quote, "In my limited observation of 17th century colonial houses of this type, I do not recall any which had them, and I cannot help feeling that they would look out of place on this particular specimen." So you have this really fascinating point that comes through again and again, where you have Winthrop Coffin and William Macy, who do not feel that the dormers are correct, even if they did exist. So you have the building experts with circumstantial evidence that says that the dormers did exist, and you have the underwriters and the president of the NHA that feel the more complex design does not fit with the historical image that we associate with old structures on Nantucket. So the question is, what version of history is going to be told? Who gets to tell it? What does it mean to restore it? Restore it to when? And ultimately, the NHA succeeds and the restoration creates the image of the oldest house without dormers that we see today.
How did people grapple with that moving forward?
So the way that this is dealt with is that the key players break up into two different groups. You had the architects, so you had Alfred Shirks, who's the architect on site. Then you had Appleton, who's kind of in charge of the restoration. They are very pro-dormer, very pro-gables. They want to put them back on. Very expensive, it's an additional cost. But then you have Winthrop Coffin, the underwriter of the project, and the president of the NHA, William Macy, who say, I don't know. Then you have Shirks and Appleton, who say, there's some evidence that they might have existed. And if they did, they would have existed when the house was initially built. And so you have to make a decision, right? Do you take on the investment and change the facade of the oldest house that this building that thousands and thousands of visitors have been visiting as early as the 1920s? Or do you take a less intrusive approach and leave the house as it is with the aesthetic that people know and come to have expected? I don't know. It's a really tough question. Ultimately, if you go visit the house, there's no dormers on it. They end up choosing the less intrusive change.
It ends up coming down to tourism a little bit, it seems like, and what keeps it going.
In part, yeah. I think it also comes down to what feels right. Dormers and gables, especially of the size that would have been on the oldest house, are very impressive, right? They're very large, and they really change the dominance of the image of a house.
Don't want to scare anyone away.
Well, this elegance in size, it feels more modern. And so even if they did exist, this idea of putting them back on feels wrong to William Macy. It feels wrong to Winthrop Coffin. And so in the absence of concrete facts, the people making the decisions, the NHA and the underwriter, decide to go with what feels more correct and feels like it fits the aesthetic of what quote-unquote old houses on Nantucket should look like. The 1920s restoration creates the image of the oldest house that we see today. And it still has come to represent this early generation of Nantucket homes. It's this really interesting and conscious decision of creating an aesthetic. And it's a decision made in the absence of concrete facts.
I don't think either side had any evidence of what they were arguing for, right? They just made a decision.
There is some evidence. There's evidence on both sides. It just isn't absolute. And so it is a debate because you have to decide, what does it mean to do a restoration? What do you want to promote? The image that people know, or completely reshape the structure without concrete evidence to show it as a different form. Ultimately, they chose the least intrusive restoration possible. They didn't change the roof line. They didn't take off the cat slide roof, right? If you were restoring it to the Jethro Coffin era, it would not be a salt box, right? This quintessential early colonial America architecture style that you see all over the island, right? It would be a Hall and Parlor style, this much boxier, much more English looking style, not the early American style. So Clay Lancaster, architectural historian on Nantucket, has a great quote that I think sums it up perfectly. He writes that, quote, "To replace the windows with an earlier type without replacing the architectural shape that went with them was to falsify the original structure, and the historic monument is left a hybrid tottering between two periods, actually constituting a third." Right, he has a very negative lens here. I don't think it has to be so negative, but I think it is really representative of what the oldest house is today. It is a living building that has existed for 340 years that has changed with the needs of the people living there. And so when we do a restoration, decisions have to be made about what is deemed important. And what they deemed important was getting it back to a moment that looked historic. And what that meant to them is maybe not what it means to us today. And I don't think it looks like it did when Jethro Coffin lived there, but it is a representation of what the oldest house is. It's a story of 340 years here on Nantucket. Keep those earbuds in, your headphones on, or your speakers going, because we'll be back with Virna from Remain Nantucket in just a moment. Welcome back to the Nantucket Gam. I'm joined now by Virna Gonzalez, who is the Programs and Grant Manager from Remain here on Nantucket. Welcome to the Nantucket Gam.
Yeah, Thomas, thank you. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me here.
It's a pleasure. When I was researching the story of the oldest house, I think one of the most fascinating parts is that it's really a history of a building across centuries. You know, we see this building change from this rectangular English-style structure to this long-roofed American salt box. What I saw again and again is that this building was modified and changed using what was available. Like in the 1920s, we had this major restoration with the NHA where lumber was used from another historic property as part of that restoration. Before that, we see that a porch on the front was actually removed and turned into a coal shed and a chicken coop behind the property. And I have to admit that this is a little bit different from how I imagine construction projects today. This idea of relying on what's already there to create something new. I wanted to reach out and have this conversation with you because as Remain is this local nonprofit that focuses on tackling environmental and community challenges, you specifically have been really vocal in advocating for greater use of architectural salvage and building material reuse here on Nantucket. So to get started, I wanted to dive into what that specifically means. What type of material can we reuse from a building, and how does it recirculate from a demolition to a construction site?
That's a really good question. Because I'm not in the building trades, I'm learning as I speak to builders out there, some architects, persons from municipalities. But from what I understand, a lot of wood materials are garnished from buildings and structures these days.
Like structural pieces, like framing or...
Yes,
studs?
we can use flooring. Yes, the structures from the studs that can be deconstructed and taken down. Windows, doors, of course, cabinetry, all of that. So it's not just the materials that create the home. It's also some of the things that are supportive in living, like the cabinets.
I guess and the follow-up to that is how is it being used? How does it actually go from a project, a place that's being either demoed or deconstructed and then brought to another source to be part of the construction project?
Yeah. So Remain isn't working directly on salvage and reuse in that capacity. So we're in an area where we're learning so much about it and trying to fill in the gaps. A lot of times it's one-on-one between builders that are taking the materials down, putting it on mostly Facebook, or they're somehow connecting to each other because everybody knows each other here. And then finding the persons that really need and want the materials. So the system in place is so basic and grassroots. And I think that's where we're starting from, that we need to like build out more. There's not a deeper system than that. And that's what I'm interested in, because what we have now is so wonderful and it's so earnest and it's so grassroots, but we're not keeping up with the pace of the, what's going on with building in this space and time. So we got to move forward. We got to be bigger and broader from here.
And I know you also helped create a report in 2022 that investigated architectural salvage and reuse here on Nantucket. I wonder if you'd tell me a little bit about that report and how it came to be.
Okay, so very interesting story. It's part of the Remain culture is creating collaborations with thinking through what's going on in the community, having a pulse on the community. And one of the things I kept cycling through is this idea of reuse and how we have so much waste material building on the island. It was in 2022 when the Nantucket Preservation Trust contacted me with an interest to learn a bit more about reuse as it stands. And so did we. We wanted to understand the landscape, the current landscape. We always believe that if you have a grounding in the research that goes on and some of the science, but in this case, research on what we are actually looking at instead of something that's anecdotal, then you can move ahead and make some smart decisions and start building on it. Let's learn about the current landscape, what's going on in construction and demolition waste, and then we started from there.
It's very interesting because you actually start both phases of the report with a similar line, and you look backwards as a comparison to the present. And you write, quote, "The island of Nantucket has a long and proud history of repurposing buildings and building components, dating back to the 17th and 18th century when reuse was common and disposing of building materials as waste was unthinkable. Only in the 20th century did construction waste disposal become an economic option." Can you explain that briefly?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about our history here, we were in isolation. This was a matter of survival, is having these materials, getting the materials from shipwrecks or from homes that were no longer usable, but only in its partiality. And then you turn around years later, here we are at this place and time where we've become a thriving community. Moreover, the population is growing, we're expanding around the island, and the building is happening at a quicker pace than we can keep up with. So we kind of lost our way a bit, and I think this is where we can kind of slow down, take a look at where we're at this point, and saying, hey, we can do better. Let's think of ways where we can take these materials and repurpose them, especially with the economic deficits that happens around building at this time. Prices are going up for new materials. And we also have tipping fees that happen when we take C&D waste off the island, and those prices are going up. Tipping fees come from either builders or homeowners in order to take the C&D waste off the island. So when you demolish a building, you're paying to demolish the building, and then you're paying for the tipping fees to move that material from Nantucket off island to places like Ohio.
Why Ohio?
Good question. I'm like, that's a podcast for the DPW.
Okay, there you go.
So please reach out to them. That's a whole other conversation.
That just surprises me, Ohio of all places to send
I know. I feel bad for Ohio, but yes, that's where a lot of that goes. So yeah, the economics actually are interesting because if you take that tipping fee out of it, we can probably save like $1.7 million that goes back into the Nantucket economy that could go towards deconstruction instead. Those costs for deconstruction are a little bit higher than demolition, and it's just a tad slower, but not as slow as you think.
when you started this report, and you mentioned that it was a very grassroots style of reuse, but do you have any indication about how much material was being reused and how much could be reused if we find a more efficient system to implement it?
I can tell you, we know basically on the C&D that's going off island.
That's construction and demo?
Construction and demolition waste. That number is the average of 17,000 tons. Tons. So I always equate it to our population. We're about 17,000 to 20,000, give or take. So if you look at it that way, it's interesting to visualize it as 1 ton of C&D waste per person, year-round person in our community every single year is being thrown out, shipped off island. From that 17,000 tons, we're giving a lowball estimate, that at least, very, very minimum, 4,500 tons can be reused. And that is the pivotal point. And there's a lot of examples of other communities that do those types of things. There's communities such as Boulder, Colorado, San Antonio, Texas, that have come to a place in salvage that's really making an impact on their own communities. And those communities are out there to be models for our own.
We are, of course, talking about waste today, but I would love to understand how we got here. You start this report comparing the practices of today to the 17th and 18th century, implicitly bringing in the oldest house to the conversation. But in that era, demolition didn't exist in the same way we think of today. You can't just run a bulldozer through a house in the 1800s. And so deconstruction really was part of the process of architectural change on Nantucket, which meant that you had more material available for reuse. So I'm wondering, when and why do we start seeing that shift away from deconstruction to demolition, especially here on Nantucket?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's one that I have passion about, and I don't know why we're in such a rush to build. I want to say that, people love it here so much, they want to be here. I know there's, economic gains from it. So there's a sense of community, it's a sense of gains. But, in all, I have to pause. I kind of don't know that. Okay. I don't know the answer to that. It's just a funny thing. I want to say, I think from years ago, there was, we started off in just building around here, going into the whaling era. Then we had a depression, and we came out of it with Beinicke's intention to change this into a place that can thrive more through tourism. And it was through tourism that really enhanced the island of Nantucket. And from there, we just kept growing, right? I think our census is now at over 17,000 persons here since 2020. And us keeping up with it and really the off-season persons that come in, that brings it up to 80,000. So that's a big change. And there's a lot of growth. And I think here I go into numbers again, but I think it's about 63% of the homes here on Nantucket are not used year-round.
It's interesting because tourism existed far before Beinecke. I mean, there's tourism that was taken off in the 1880s, almost 100 years before Beinecke came. But tourism is really part of this drive to maintain a very specific historical aesthetic. The oldest house looks the way it does because people didn't want to tear it down and rebuild it. It was preserved. And I'm wondering if in your conversations about reuse and historic salvage, does this historical aesthetic that Nantucket really prides itself on, does that come into the conversation at all?
I want to say there's quality and value in all of it. So, of course, when you have older materials, we must preserve them. And they need to be preserved. But also we have younger homes that are just aesthetically not pleasing. And the materials on that are newer, right? And those still have value, especially when we have a housing crisis at our feet. And it's in that lens that I say everything as far as building materials, they count, they matter. And I'll also say it's interesting because the older materials, like the older wood pieces or windows and doors, there's something about the preservation that really holds our heritage that becomes so precious. They can actually be served more of an aesthetic value when it comes to keeping these structures healthy and strong.
One of the basic questions, but why is this important? Why is architectural salvage and reuse important?
I say, why wouldn't it be important? I just see it as important as its basis, right? We've become such a disposable society that we are even asking the question. So I find it so interesting to kind of be asked that. But it's important to the environment, first of all and foremost. We have a way of seeing waste as something magical that goes away. You know, we can put it in a box. We can have somebody come and pick it up in a truck and off it goes. Or we can bring it to the dump and it magically disappears. And, you know, that's just part of the story. When you see how it gets processed, where it goes, where it ends up, and the quantity that's out there, it's kind of hard to keep up with all of that. So I personally think we have a responsibility to take our time and pause and look at it and think twice. You know, is this particular item of value? Can I learn how to give it to somebody else? Some things really need to get thrown out.
Yeah.
And let them get thrown out. They need to go. So I get that. But in the instances where there are things that you really innately know that could have a second life, give it a second life. Give it a chance. So if we all do that, that's our stewardship.
When I was reading the report, it was really interesting because you focus on demolition and deconstruction so heavily. And in some ways, I was a bit intimidated by that because the oldest house is sort of the opposite. It is the oldest house on its original foundation, not demolished or deconstructed. But I quickly realized that it's also a great example of how architectural salvage works, where you just reuse the whole structure. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Nantucket has the highest proportion of house moves anywhere in the country. Does your work focus on house moves as well as a form of recycling?
Yes, I'll say this. I'm so glad you brought that up because the best way to support the environment and to support waste is just moving homes in their entirety, period. That in itself is something that Nantucket is very good at and we can do more of. So to support that effort, because there are so many homes that are permitted for demo and move. So a demo move permit is issued by the HDC. It's a move off, move on, or demolition. So those are the choices. It's a specialized approval required before any structure can be torn down or physically relocated. So it's basically there to give a timeline for the house to be moved off the property and moved on to another.
What do you mean it gives a timeline?
So it used to be that we had only 60 days to find a person who is interested in a house that was slated and permitted for demolition, that they would get all of their work, all their due diligence done before they can receive the house.
And have land, which is also
have land, have an engineer and a surveyor, survey the property, make sure it could fit in the property. And then you have all the requirements like, sewer and everything that it takes. So there's so many permits that needs to happen in order to receive home onto your property, there wasn't enough time during those 60 days to have it happen. So Nantucket Preservation Trust saw that gap, and in 2024 put it in an article to the town of Nantucket to have a demolition delay. So in essence, it's giving more time for persons interested in receiving homes to establish all the permitted they need, make sure the property can receive it.
I would say you're not stuck in traffic until you're stuck behind a house. Like that is a...
I applaud, and I am happy to wait for a house to be moved, because it just tells me somebody on Nantucket is getting a home.
I remember I had to get to work early one day and I was driving, and I think I was on Milestone. I come on the corner and there was just a house doing what felt like a 27-point turn, trying to get around the intersection.
That's
and
amazing.
I've never been stuck in traffic behind a building before. It just made me laugh.
Absolutely incredible to see. And if nobody's ever seen it, please come to Nantucket and take a look at that. Because I tell you, that is one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen is a house move. So yeah, it takes so much time, and you were up against the clock that it just wasn't feasible, that 60 days. So what Preservation Trust did, and I do applaud their work, is saying, hey, we need to slow this down a lot more. There's too many logistics that need to go into place in order to, have a structure received. So it was voted in unanimously by town vote in September 2024. And that's really helping the process. So we're hoping that keeps happening, because, with the deficit that we have in housing, we have such an asset right under our feet. And it's these homes on these properties that can have second life. Seeing a home have a new address.
Yeah.
Only on Nantucket.
I will say, it's not something I'd ever experienced before coming out here, is having houses in different locations and seeing them blocked up and shuffled around the island. Like you said, it's pretty neat.
Yeah. And I will say, for the original homeowner, I would have to see it as a sense of pride to say, hey, my former home is now with somebody in the community out in this location. I mean, that's
And are
great.
they selling it to them?
No, actually, it's free, technically, right? But all of the costs of moving the home and getting all those permits, that gets put on to the new homeowner.
Well, to tie it back to history, again, this is not new. For many people who know Nantucket history, the initial English settlement was out in Kapalm, out towards Nantucket. And when that harbor eventually silted in and became a pond, they actually moved many of the structures to what is now the town. So we have a long history of house moving on this island.
Everything has value when you're considering that against what it costs to build new, which I think is now at about $1,000 per square foot,
Wow.
from what I understand.
Since your report came out, in which you talk about architectural reuse and material salvage here in Nantucket, have you seen any shift in the culture or ideology around it?
Yes, absolutely. It was last September when we at Remain hosted a deconstruction workshop. So that was bringing persons from the building trades together for a one-day class with an organization called Boston Building Resources. They're a salvage and reuse company up in Boston, and we wanted to learn from them. And the classroom was filled to capacity, and the demand was so high that we had to add an extra day. And then that class was filled to capacity. And from all the persons that had attended, I'm learning that they're seeing so much, because they're, I'll say, really at ground zero. They're seeing with their own eyes on site how much is being taken away, thrown out, and rushed, that they feel like there's a sense of urgency and there's a sense of responsibility. And that's why they wanted to be there. So the goodwill is more than there. These are the persons that are coming together to do something about it. And they were very happy to come as a team There's so many challenges that deconstruction in itself faces, right? Speaking to training, specialized training, it's building, it's out there, it's already happened.
And they're training them to deconstruct in a way that preserves more material than demolition does.
Correct. The amount of time, I'll just talk about time for a second. The amount of time it takes to deconstruct a structure is, let's say, about a week plus, maybe 2 weeks. So in the grand scheme of things, you can demo a place and it's demoed in a day, and then you're pulling materials over a couple days. It's not so weighty when you're comparing it to a deconstruction process that can happen in up to 2 weeks. Okay. Training, if people know how to build it, they kind of know how to deconstruct it. It's just doing it backwards.
We started our conversation talking about how demolition didn't really happen in the 17th and 18th century like we see today, and how buildings like the Order's house are the product of this constant cycle of reuse of material. We also mentioned how demolition and dumping of the C&D waste in Ohio is faster and cheaper. So what motivations do you see to encourage people to reuse architectural salvage, knowing it does take on a slightly higher financial burden?
Yeah, so it goes back to problem solving our community needs for housing in one respect, right? And even persons here that have homes that need to update them and renovate, that's another solution. I'll say for the homeowners that are looking to demo, there's financial incentives for them as well. There are places that can help evaluate the materials and offer tax deductions. So there's that benefit. And I would say, given that, please talk to your accountants and lawyers about that if you're considering it. And so when you're having that factored in, it becomes more financially neutral. And could that tip somebody's thoughts on, hey, let's give it the time to have this house moved or deconstruct it instead of demolish it?
So we just sort of dove into some of the incentives for homeowners who are looking to demolish or deconstruct a home, but looking from the other side, is there a way for people like me or construction companies who want to use architectural salvage and reuse building material, where could they find it here on Nantucket?
Yeah, so very good question. That is some of the work that Remained is trying to build on. So there are a couple of communication opportunities out there, and still it's this grassroots kind of effort at this point. So I would say if anybody has materials that they want to offer, or if there's any materials that they want to gain, please go to Facebook. There's the Nantucket Architectural Salvage page. We have Buying Nothing Nantucket. We have the Nantucket Year-Round Community, and we have Nantucket Consignments.
Those are all Facebook pages?
All Facebook pages. There are 2 nonprofit companies that you could seek and find and talk to. They're new. They are on the cusp of this salvage and reuse work, and it's wonderful to see. So I'll say Nantucket Salvage and Deconstruction Company is run by Chris Carey. That is a nonprofit organization that just opened its doors last summer. And so if you have a deconstruction job that you'd like to consider and have materials moved and reused, please contact Chris Carey. Another person in this salvage and reuse network is Whitney Schrouth, and she's the proprietor of Nantucket Salvage. She's an architect who uses intentional design, and she's sustainability driven and is community focused. So she's just starting her salvage work. And if you find Whitney, she can help you as well.
You just mentioned 2 people who could help with deconstruction, but what about someone who wants to tap into the free houses that are being moved? Is there a way to do that?
Yes. So I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm working in collaboration with Nantucket Preservation Trust, and together we're building a website that's going to house all of the structures that are permitted for demolition or move. They're going to be listed. There's going to be details about it. It's going to be available to the public. There's going to be a whole understanding on the processes involved from beginning to end, soup to nuts, on, prepping your land first and then how to receive the structure and the processes involved, all the permitting. We're going to have a section where you can find all the permits that would be required for house moves, and then other resources for persons in the community that might want to donate a house and what would be involved in that and some of the tax benefits that could be potentially helpful to them. So it's going to be all under one website. It's going to be called Rehome Nantucket, and it's going to come out hopefully later this year.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Well, Virna, this has been a fascinating conversation and helping me think about connecting the past and present practices on Nantucket. On this relatively resource-sparse island, when you had to ship most things over, historically, you were motivated to use what was here, and that defined our architectural landscape and buildings like the oldest house. But this has been incredibly insightful in helping me understand how that tradition is carried forward today, even when it's not necessarily always the instinctual decision it once was. So, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Nantucket Gam.
Thomas, thanks so much for having me. It was such a pleasure being here with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the time.
For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.